Here we go. So welcome everybody, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Anders Ericsson, who is a Swedish psychologist and a Conradi eminent scholar and professor of psychology at Florida State University, and is internationally recognized as the expert in the new field of expertise and peak performance. He's also the co-author of this wonderful book, Peak, and Dr. Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole, How All of Us Can Achieve Extraordinary Things. Dr. Ericsson, welcome to today's call.
I'm really looking forward to, discussing these interesting issues with you.
I'm super excited, and I just want to actually, if you don't mind, just quote one of the testimonials off the front of this book, because I think it basically says it all in my opinion. The gentleman who was the author of Moonwalking with Einstein, Joshua Farr, says, quote, "This book could truly change the world." And I happen to agree with him. So there should be a link, guys, somewhere on this page. Go ahead and buy this book. Buy several copies. Give them to friends, family, loved ones. I've bought plenty of these books and I will continue to do so, because I truly believe that this book can change lives.
Well, thank you so very, very much. And I think, I've been doing research now for many decades, so it's kind of really, a delight here to be able to share some of the insights with the hope here that, will open some doors and allowing people to see opportunities that they didn't see before in terms of what they actually can achieve.
That's wonderful. It gives people a sense of control, I feel, which maybe they just thought was just some kind of, potential beyond what they were ever capable of.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is this idea that, skill is something that you build, and that's the reason why just wishing that you're going to get better doesn't seem to do the job. You need to be willing here to kind of go through the process of building the performance that you're striving for.
Yeah. And
I think that's the reason why, if you were to be able to work with a teacher, somebody who's actually been able to help other people, go from your current level to the level that you aspire to, that is the kind of opportunity and the empirical evidence that you're capable of changing. But it also means that it's going to be sometimes a pretty challenging path, but once you're kind of really committed here to this change, I think you will find it a very exciting journey.
Yeah, I completely agree. So just for my audience, for people who perhaps don't know who you are, could you give us sort of a brief overview of what the book's actually about?
Well, the book is kind of tracking some of the work that I've been doing for the last 30, 40 years. Okay. And I guess I started out being interested in trying to understand why some people are performing at a much higher level than others. And the method that I started out using was actually having people think out loud while they were doing tasks. And that allowed me to identify that, much of the differences between people's ability to solve problems and make decisions, can really be understood by hearing, them express what they're actually taking into account and what their thinking is. And the idea is that as you get more expert, you're actually building this way of perceiving situations in the world that allows you to see further, to be able to see consequences. But that is not something that, you could just, read a book and now basically immediately apply. You're really building a skill, not unlike how you acquire skill in tennis and golf and other things. And we find, that the same principles that apply to more sort of, mental skills and decision making, seem to be evidenced even when we're looking at something like golf or tennis. So basically, a very skilled golfer would be able to kind of explore and look at the green and actually have a sense here what the ball path should be in order to get very close to the hole.
Right.
Or, if you have an obstacle, thinking about different types of shots and, knowing how accurate you would be here in terms of if you hit it 10 times, what would be the distribution and how would you then be able to select the point that you're aiming for to minimize the risk here that you basically get into a difficult lie.
Wonderful. Absolutely unbelievable. So, but this is not just mutually exclusive to sports, am I right?
Exactly. So, we've looked at chess, and more recently I've been sort of working and observing master surgeons and doctors and also been working with teachers, and essentially any type of professional. We're looking for that reproducible evidence here that somebody can actually do something better than other individuals. So in many cases, where you actually have competitions, but I mean, that's something that happened over time. When people played chess originally, they just did it socially, but then people got interested here in comparing people's chess abilities. So you arrange tournaments, and now somebody who is winning against all the other players, and thus the winner of the tournament, that person can do something that is better than some of the other attendees of the tournament.
Right. And what is it that's separating them? Fascinating.
Exactly. So once you know that they can perform better, then the next question is, what is it that makes them different? And that's when we try to bring them into the lab, where we actually will be able to demonstrate when they're confronting similar situations that the expert is actually thinking about it in a superior way, and that basically then would allow people who are performing at a lower level to kind of understand now some of the differences that they need to acquire in order to increase their performance.
Would it be right in saying that that's going to naturally help retain more people in a certain discipline, as people look at people who are above them sometimes and they almost quit maybe prematurely, whereas if they actually thought it was attainable and there was processes for that, this is going to drag the averages up across the board. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, no, definitely. And you see that, again here, just looking at sports, what used to be kind of the performance of amateurs in marathon or basically any domain when you're looking, today the performance is vastly superior. And everyone, I think, agrees that, the differences in how people train is actually a major explanation now for this increased performance. And I think that's going to be true in domains that we've looked at, professional domains, that if you were able to develop now professional continued development sort of opportunities, I think, people would be able to perform better. And I think in every situations, and I think it's particularly clear when it comes to doctors, if you as a doctor can produce better patient outcomes, that's a great value to society. But I also think that in other professions, if you can actually, sell people the products that is going to make their life better in a way that actually is consistent now with increasing their, life quality, that's an important thing. And I would argue that once you look for these sort of objective measures of success, you would be able to help people improve and thereby improve everyone's and would be benefiting.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting what you've just said. So from an educator's perspective, like the pair of us, just obviously in very different fields, if I can understand that these processes exist, then I can implement them and again drag up the averages of all my students combined as a result of that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and also I think in our book we really kind of point out that when you're getting better, it's not like you're just more or less automating things and just relying on your intuition, so you don't really have any idea if you make a mistake why you made a mistake.
Right.
Instead, we see that experts remain engaged. So they actually, if things don't happen the way they expected them, that's would create now some stimulus for thinking here. Why did I expect this, and why didn't it happen? And was there anything that actually information that was available to me or that I could have basically found that would have actually allowed me now to make a better prediction here of the actual outcome, and thereby, basically being able to achieve a better outcome.
So it's going to have a bigger stick factor, isn't it? People are going to bite down on the gum shield and keep going in the face of negative results, etc.
Well, and I think if you look at training, if you don't push yourself, you're just doing things that you already know how to do, then basically you're not going to get any better. So it's almost like you need to set a goal that's now outside of what you normally are able to do. And the failure is now kind of a necessary step here for you to actually be able to make slight improvements until you are able to reach the goal. And obviously, if you have kind of a teacher that would be able to tell you now what are the things that you could be doing now to basically improve your ability for dealing with a certain type of situations.
That's fascinating. I'm going to come back to that point in a little while if I can. Okay, so in the book you obviously mention many different examples of so-called prodigies that historically, and everybody looking at them always thought they were just naturally gifted or gifts from God, naturally talented. Could you give me maybe a historical example of an individual and maybe a current example where everybody sort of believed that there were prodigies and you were able to prove otherwise, and what evidence you had to support that?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is with prodigies, especially, when children or young adolescents are performing at a very high level, it's very surprising. And I remember the first couple of times I saw that, I was invited to Japan, but instead of seeing one violin prodigy, I saw like 200 of them perform. and that gave you sort of an idea, in the same way that when you go to a different country and you see 3-year-olds speaking Chinese, it's almost like amazing how they're able to do that. But once you see how, thousands or millions or I guess, children are able to achieve these skills, it sort of suggests that this is not something that you're born with, but it's really kind of something that can be elicited by parents providing the right kind of educational environment that actually would allow you to achieve that level. And one of the things is that if you're part of an audience, you don't see those thousands of hours that parents work with their children to develop these skills. You only see the final product. And I think that maybe has stimulated this idea here that, basically you find that parents may be overemphasizing here the fact that the children were doing this by themselves, when in fact we know that the parents are a really important part of actually helping the children develop these skills.
Sorry to interrupt, go on.
And I've been looking now for 30 years for counterexamples of anybody who, more or less suddenly realized that they had this ability. And I've yet to find a plausible case where you actually do have, detailed information about what this child or their parents were doing prior to demonstrating this ability.
Wow, mind-blowing. And so do you then think that in that situation, imagine that the young boy or young girl has been going through this process with the family and maybe some external coaching, etc., and when they turn up on the scene, they are just so far ahead of all of their peers for their age group, they stick out like a sore thumb, which then sort of repeats, follows the narrative that, oh my goodness, these kids must be they're just so good, what other explanation can it be? And then they ultimately get hoovered up into the training system regionally and then nationally, internationally, etc.
I think that's true. There's one thing, though, that people have documented, and that is when parents actually more or less, work with their children and not allowing the children to develop that independence. You can now have a child that is performing as a prodigy in an amazing way when they're 15, 16. But these prodigies typically don't make the next step here of becoming very successful adult musicians. And people have suggested, or at least that's my own assessment, that these parents more or less just helped these children to play these pieces. They did not help them develop the representations that allow now these children, when they become adolescents and adults, to actually have representations where they could actually now produce new music and actually keep developing themselves in a way that is necessary if you're going to be successful at the adult musician level.
Wow, amazing. So just if you don't mind, I'd like to switch gears, and the majority of the interviews that I've watched so far are sort of predicated on the sort of proving the premise, and I'd like to actually just take it from the perspective that we're all in, right? We totally are with you in this. And maybe look at from sort of start to finish, the beginning to mastery, and look at the processes. I'd be really interested to sort of explore that, if that's okay.
No, that's just fine.
Brilliant.
And I think, that is maybe also what most people would be the most interested in, because it would be most relevant if they want to acquire some new skills.
Wonderful. So okay, so from that perspective, let's say you're a parent. What would you say is the optimal age to get a child into some type of sport or discipline, irrespective of what it is? What would you say is the optimal age?
Well, I think it a little bit depends, but I think what the key is that the parent now identifies an activity that they basically want to be part of. And, oops. Okay. So, I'm sorry here.
No worries.
My phone here is creating. Do you have possibility of editing out things?
Yeah, we could take that out. No.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
So this idea here that you basically are looking for an activity that you as a parent and child can kind of discover together. Well, I guess I'm going to have to unplug this. So, one question that many parents have is, how would I be able to provide an opportunity for my children? And I think, there may be a track if you really, have reasons to believe now that your child would, eventually want to be world class in some domain. But I think the more I've been working, I've been more interested in sort of, how would we be able to develop circumstances that would be beneficial to any child? And I think that for a parent to find an activity that they enjoy and then introducing the child into that activity, and then basically at some point really helping them, start with training where they can actually build their performance and get sort of a experience of what it's like to be able to, attain a level of mastery where you can kind of image what you're doing and be in control over your own learning process. And I think, obviously if you're very successful in a domain, you might, think about, really sort of selecting a path here that would allow you the option at least to be reaching the highest levels. But for any child, getting that experience of what it takes to be really good at something, I think has some real benefits when it comes to learning in school. And in particular, I think when it comes to, developing your own professional mastery. And talking to surgeons, I find a lot of the really superior surgeons, they had a period in their adolescence or childhood where they were really committed to being the best that they could be in martial arts, dance, music. And when they actually now started developing to become surgeons, in their mid-20s, they had that insight into what it takes to now develop that skill of being able now to plan a surgery And then once you're in a surgical situation, being aware of all the critical factors.
Right.
So if something happens, you would be able to respond in the most optimal way.
Wow. So do you think there's an age, or do you think that the parents need to have an interest in the discipline as well, and the child shows some type of basic enthusiasm for it? Do you think that helps with the whole motivation, even from both sides, right? I'm sure a parent's going to get a little pig sick of having to take little Timmy to the training on a cold winter's night. Do you think that's very important?
I think that is very important, because a child, I think it's very motivating to get this one-on-one. And I think for parents, having that one-on-one and actually having a joint interest, I think has a lot of benefits that will now set the stage here for making that commitment of trying to improve and getting to higher levels. And I think often, as you were pointing out, the parent probably tires before the child in many cases. And I think, there are many of these activities that require, either going to a music teacher or, in other cases, bringing the child now to a training environment where they would be able to engage in this activity. So
with that in mind, you've got this child, they're enthusiastic. You're certainly starting from an enthusiastic place. At what point do you stop the fun? And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be part of the process, but at what point do you start the deliberate practice? And could you explain what deliberate practice is, please?
Right. So playing around and engaging, making music together in an informal way, or playing, soccer or basketball or whatever the activity is, that seems to be inherently enjoyable. But what I think is really important is to find, but not making it now a choice, but more identifying now some activity that can be improved, and now showing that in parallel with the playing, you can now engage in maybe 15 to 30 minutes per day with this more structured training where the focus is not enjoyment, but it's actually trying to enhance your performance in this particular type of activity. And over time, you could extend it. But I think it's really key not to push the child to engage in this activity for longer than they actually have that ability of being focused on the activity and making progress.
Yeah, I wanted to come to that, yeah.
And I think also it's really important as soon as possible to make the child in control of how long they're going to be doing it, especially if they want to expand on it, because you really don't want to get to a point where the child is burning out on training or stopping to push and really try to sustain that full concentration.
Right. And I suppose we're developing ways now as well, because I suppose at some moment, as the child develops, they are going to have to take on board a higher workload. But I suppose there's developments now in, how good rest and relaxation is away from the discipline.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the striking things that we found with very successful individuals. They're really trying to protect, their homeostasis, so that they don't, engage in more training that wouldn't allow them then, when they get back to the training activity, to have that full concentration.
Right.
So you have to be attuned here that you get enough recuperation and rest, and maybe during that time, you would engage in playing and doing other things that, a child and an adolescent would be expected to do.
Right. That's fascinating. So it brings me on to this concept of feedback from your deliberate practice. You mentioned feedback in the book and also focus. I think you've kind of touched on that, but could you just maybe detail a little more how feedback fits into deliberate practice?
So feedback is the key here to be able to go from one level of performance to the next. And you, with a training activity, that training activity you can do at a certain level, but then now you're setting a goal that you want to achieve a higher level of control or speed or whatever. And then you have multiple trials, and being able now to observe your own performance or the outcome of the performance, you will now get information about how well you're doing and whether you're gradually, getting closer to this goal that you have of being able to be accurate and reproducible. Right. And that kind of idea here of knowing what you're really trying to achieve and then being able to monitor when you do it, whether you're actually getting closer, that seems to be the core of deliberate practice that is quite different from, mindless repeating, doing a certain activity that has much more limited benefit.
Yeah, it's more harmful, right? I use the analogy, if I found out that Tiger Woods practiced 100 hours a week and I did 150 hours a week, I'm clearly not going to get better than him, and I'm just going to get really good at bad habits because his process is so much higher, you've been doing it so much longer, etc.
Right, and I think that's where this idea here that if you can't concentrate fully, you can't be at the limits of your current performance, right. And thereby you're less likely now to be able to raise that performance to an even higher level. So if you start just repeating and trying now, jogging, a marathon, that's not going to produce, exceptional marathon performance. You need to be, at your limit, and you have to pace yourself so you're really not, spending more time. So you're forced now to perform at a much lower level because then obviously that's not going to enhance your speed and performance.
And in terms of the feedback, Doctor, how often should you strive to get feedback from your deliberate practice? I'm assuming that when you get to a certain level, you probably want that feedback on a daily basis, but I'm cognizant of the fact, parents might not have the finances to have that type of level of training at first. So is it a weekly thing with the hopes of getting to a daily thing, or how would you sort of summarize that?
I think it's interesting that some parents who hire coaches, for maybe a weekly meeting. Now, in the beginning, the parents may actually understand better what the goals for the training would be, and they would then be able to work with the child when they're training, making sure now that they are kind of focusing and having an idea here of the goal. Because if the child goes off by themselves, it may be occasionally, that they actually stop and they will just kind of keep repeating what they have been doing as opposed to engaging in this concentrated effort of refining their performance. And I think it would be interesting to have the child talk about what they're thinking about while they're training as a way here of making sure that they're really engaged and they're actually looking for things that they want to make small changes to that are likely to really enhance their performance.
Yeah, wonderful. And in terms of getting that feedback from a coach, how would you advise a parent to go about selecting a coach to start with, and then maybe how do you make those decisions to change the coaches and adjust at what point do you think that you get kind of stuck in this process and it's time for change? But importantly, how do you select those coaches? Is there a process you might advise for that, how to select these coaches?
Well, one thing that we've been, Robert and I have been talking about would be if coaches actually could have a listing of their prior clients. Right. And if you had videos seeing where they started out and where they ended up. Now you could have confidence here that this coach has done this with 20 children previously. That would strike me as a compelling evidence that knows how to work with children. And very often the coach is going to be, at least in the beginning, focused on that motivation, especially until the child gets to that point where they can take ownership of the skill so they can now start, becoming more independent and be able to explore ways that they can improve while they're engaging in this weekly practice.
That's profound. So imagine if you could have a structure from the beginning to elite level. Imagine if the coaches published the clients and they had that, like I once knew a gentleman whose brother worked at Sheikh Mohammed Stud Farm in Newmarket in England, and he had the foals to 2-year-olds. And then they moved on to the main stud from there. He never had them after that. But of course they can track that quality all the way through the ranks to obviously the elite level. That would be something else if those structures existed, more broadly speaking.
Yeah, and I find this idea that if you as a parent could document the development of your child, I mean, let's assume here we had videotapes of Tiger Woods training. You could see here from year to year how he was changing.
Yeah.
I think that would just deepen our knowledge here of what it takes and how these changes happen, and making people's expectation here of how long certain changes may take much more, valid and appropriate here. Because one of the problems is if you have a sense here that you're not improving as fast as you should, well, if it ends up that you're just wrong about how fast other people have improved.
It took them, yeah. That's interesting. Do you think, though, there's a reluctance on the part of these people who've mastered the craft to actually give it back? Because in some ways, a lot of those people have drank the Kool-Aid in many ways about their own skill sets. They're already thinking that there is something special about them. Not in every case, but so do you think there would be a reluctance to pass that down, or?
No, I've obviously talked to a select group, but I have to say that these individuals who have been very successful that I talk to, once they get to a point where they may not be actively performing, I think at that point they may be quite interested in sharing.
Yeah.
Now, I can see here that, say, a football player or a basketball player may have some reluctance to share information about their thinking when they're active, because that information could then be possibly used against them by their competitors.
Yeah.
But once you get to the point here where you're no longer actively competing against other individuals, I think that may be a time when they would really have time and energy to share that information. But it's interesting that once you retire, that's typically when the interest in you decreases.
Goes down. That's fascinating. So in the book, Doctor, you talk about the violin being one of those things where the process is very, very defined over centuries. If you do A, you get B. Super difficult, going to take you forever, an insane amount of hard work, but it's defined and it's centuries old. If a parent is, or if anyone indeed is looking to develop a new skill, how do you know if there is a very developed process, and if you're void of a very defined process? I think you refer to it in the book where you say, you can be sure that's the case if people are still saying, these people are naturally talented or have gifts from God. There's some gap in their understanding. If that's the case, what do you do about it?
I think that's where I see a really exciting opportunity of going out and trying out to document skill in new domains. And now, obviously, if you're the first one to reach and you're the best in the world, now there wouldn't be any teachers that would actually be able to help you. I think there's some interesting evidence that people who are exceptional in one domain then start looking at other individuals in other domains and now actually learning while they're trying now to reach their ultimate goal.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that Robert and I have been talking about, that if you understand how you actually achieve a skill in one domain, you may be able to look at that and now transfer some of the insights into how you effectively improve that skill in that domain and apply that to a different domain.
Wow. So I was thinking about this in just like in simple terms for somebody to try and, like, if we're void of that happening for the meantime, would it be a potential path to think, okay, so my son or my child, or I'm at point A, I want to get to point B. Point B is not really a destination because I imagine people are always striving, but I want to get to mastery. And maybe go and find some of these retired athletes or musicians, or maybe read all the books that you can from them, try and maybe through social media contact them, maybe go on a sportsman's evening with them and try and grab their ear for 5 minutes and just try and understand the broad processes that made a really good centre midfielder, as an example. If your son or daughter's going to be a footballer and play specifically in that area, and try and get, like, you're probably, I imagine, going to get like an aggregated view of what makes a great centre midfielder, and there'll obviously be slight differences and nuances, and kind of take that and then work back and then look at the weaknesses at point A, and then maybe go, okay, one of the common themes was you need an explosive turn of pace over 10 yards. Okay, well, perhaps my son or daughter doesn't quite have that. So let's go sideways and find 3 or 4 new experts in sprinting, say, and do deliberate practice in that area, and then go forward. Would you say that's a sensible way to do it, void of any process that currently exists?
I think those are very interesting ideas, and I think the challenge would be when you're trying to do something where you wouldn't have examples. I personally have been looking for examples of individuals who have been able to improve some specific aspect. And if one could be looking for an individual or an adolescent that had documented their improvement in this particular aspect, that would seem to me now to be a particularly interesting resource. And maybe if you talk to teachers and coaches, they would have knowledge here about individuals who went through this particular